So this morning in particular, it was inspiring to see the bonds of solidarity so strong across the labor movement across Canada. So history has shown us that when people act from a place of fear instead of from a place of hope, they sometimes turn to the right. Around the world, including in Canada, right-wing populism is becoming more prevalent and more pronounced. Because working people feel left behind. But it's more than just a feeling, it is a reality. Many communities across the country have been shut out of political and economic power, particularly as the divide between the working class and the rich continues to grow, as our social safety net is systemically dismantled, as our institutions fail us, and as the Canadian dream becomes increasingly out of reach. And the right has tapped into those realities, stoking fears that there isn't enough for everyone, villainizing and targeting marginalized groups in the process. And they have been successful. They are sweeping the nation with 7 out of 10 provinces run by conservative governments. And I've been invited here to speak today to share our experience in Ontario since the Ford government won a majority in June. To share how our decent work laws have been undermined, how our public services have been attacked, how the health of our communities has been jeopardized, and how access to justice for equity-seeking groups has been compromised. Unfortunately, our experience in Ontario will not be unique. It is becoming clear that Doug Ford and Jason Kenney are one and the same. Even Kenney has admitted that they finish each other's sentences. There's no doubt that he will be calling shots from the Ford playbook and vice versa. And I know that the people in this room and the activists that came before us have been fighting against a conservative regime for over 40 years. And that is a testament to your resiliency, strength, and commitment to deliver social and economic justice in the province of Alberta. But if Kenney is anything like Ford, then I can guarantee you that this will be unlike anything that has ever been seen. There is a new era of conservatism, and it is getting bolder. Nothing is safe, and nothing is sacred. Not even the highest law of Canada, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Never in Ontario's history, for example, has the notwithstanding clause been invoked. But the Ford government was willing to use it, to override the Charter when they were legally challenged. And that won't be the last time that they threaten to use it. We are seeing unprecedented attacks in Ontario, multiple times a day from every angle. Progressive gains are being carelessly undone, and we don't know what, if anything, will be left standing. And that is likely the reality that Alberta will be facing. It is no longer business as usual. And how labor and the progressive movement at large responds will need to be fundamentally different. But I know that we will rise to the challenge. People are not the government's priority, it's businesses. With every announcement, Ford and Kenney make it abundantly clear, open for business means workers must sacrifice their rights and their protections. Their actions are rooted in a larger conservative ideology that includes shrinking the size of government, reducing access to the unions, undermining the collective, driving down wages in the public and private sectors, attacking workplace benefits like healthcare and pensions, and contracting out more work. Less than a month in power, the Ford government introduced back-to-work legislation for workers on strike, a blatant attack on their constitutional right and their fight for decent work. And that was not an isolated incident. Other workers were legislated back to work before the year ended. In November, they systematically dismantled decent work laws with their Making Ontario Open for Business Act, including repealing the scheduled $15 minimum wage, removing 2 paid sick days, eliminating equal pay for equal work, canceling fair scheduling rules, and reverting to laws that made it harder to access union protection. All measures that disproportionately affect women workers, workers of color, and other equity-seeking groups. Shortly thereafter, they had canceled laws that would have helped bridge the gender wage gap. And as of this year, the government has mandated that provincial agencies will need to obtain approval of their bargaining mandates and the ratification of collective agreements. They've also signaled that they're looking to expand collective bargaining oversight to other areas of the broader public sector. In December, they opened the door for non-union shops in the construction trades to bid on and build public infrastructure projects. We know that unionized construction trades are leaders in health and safety, but the Ford government decided to put worker and public safety at great risk and trampled on collective bargaining rights. And finally, the Ford government announced the Student Choice Initiative earlier this year, which will allow post-secondary students to opt out of paying union fees. Based on these attacks, the introduction of right-to-work legislation isn't far behind. This is where employees are entitled to work in unionized workplaces without actually joining the union or paying regular union dues. The elimination of automatic dues checkoff is another possibility, in which case unions will be forced to go member to member, month after month to collect dues. Of course, that's only from those members that choose to pay their dues. There may be new financial reporting requirements for unions. The law already imposes a duty on unions to provide employees with audited financial statements. But under Harper, for example, unions and federations were required to provide the government with annual financial reporting, including details of all payments on political activities and the percentage of time spent on it. If introduced, this will hinder the ability of unions to do important advocacy work. We may also see the end of statutory bargaining units, impacting those workers in the broader public sector, including public servants, as well as legislation that limits the scope of collective bargaining, such as restricting it only to wages. And as we speak, the Ontario government is holding a quote-unquote consultation with unions on public sector wages. That means that legislative measures that impose wage caps or restraints on total compensation packages isn't far behind. Unfortunately, these are not scenarios that are specific to Ontario. We could see them playing out across Canada, including in Alberta. Just a few weeks ago, the Ford government delivered their first budget, which cuts or freezes spending in nearly every ministry by taking from the vulnerable and giving to the rich. The reality is that conservative governments, including those run by Ford and Kenney, are often singularly focused on cutting program spending, not increasing revenues. But as we learned a few days ago, Alberta already spends the lowest amount on programs as a percentage of the economy within Canada. And Ontario already has the lowest program spending per person of any province in this country. So while vulnerable communities bear the brunt of public service cuts, businesses in Ontario, for example, will receive $3.8 billion in corporate tax relief over the next 6 years. The Ford government has consistently prioritized big businesses and the wealthy over Ontarians, and the budget was no different. Ford has famously said on more than one occasion that not one person will lose a job under his government. That's clearly not true. We know that cuts to public services mean job cuts, and every job cut in the public sector means a service loss in the community. Ontario already spends the lowest amount per person on health care in the entire country, and the Ontario budget leaves our healthcare system, including hospitals, billions of dollars short. Mental health care funding has been slashed by $335 million per year. That means that there's going to be longer waits, less supports, and more Ontarians in need. Ontario's version of pharmacare, which provided free prescription drugs for Ontarians 24 and under, has been carved out so families with the sickest kids are now hit the hardest. But most notably, the Ford government has made one of the biggest structural changes to Ontario's healthcare system. They passed a bill recently that dissolves numerous specialized and regional healthcare providers to create a singular super agency, Ontario Health. The government now has extraordinary powers to privatize our healthcare system, to order mega mergers and transfers of important healthcare services, and to undermine unionized workers' rights. In addition, they're going to be looking to cut $500 million from our provincial health insurance plan so that tests and procedures, such as those related to diabetes treatment, pain management, colonoscopies, will no longer be covered. And just a few days ago, they ended health insurance coverage for Ontarians traveling outside of the country. It's clear that the Ford government is undoing our universal healthcare system. So instead of a health card, Ontarians now need a credit card to access healthcare services. Under the Ford government, per-student funding has decreased. Average class sizes, however, will be increasing for grades 4 through 12, with some classes seeing more than 40 students in a room. This will undoubtedly jeopardize students' learning environments, eliminate thousands of education workers, including teachers, across the province, reduce access to elective courses and after-school programs. In the face of overcrowding classrooms and laying off teachers, the government has mandated that some high school courses be taught online, for no regard to students' access to internet or their learning styles. Ontario's education minister believes that increasing average class sizes will benefit students across the province by making them more resilient. This government believes that spoiling our children means providing them with access to high-quality education. Unsurprisingly, because of these regressive changes to public education, parents are turning to private schools for their kids. Registration is up 30% in some of these schools since the government's announcements. Ontario is home to the most expensive childcare in the country across all age groups. And those fees will continue to rise. The government just canceled a fund that helps stabilize childcare costs for families. And instead of building spaces that are affordable, high quality, and publicly delivered, through different measures, the government has increased the capacity of the private sector to deliver childcare. They have lifted the cap on the amount of public funding that can be spent towards for-profit care. And most recently, they passed laws that relax restrictions around the number of children home care providers, both regulated and unregulated, can care for at any given time. It's important to understand that these regulations were introduced years ago after several infant deaths in Ontario. Ford's first attack on post-secondary education was threatening institutions with funding cuts if they did not allow all speech, including racist and discriminatory remarks, on campus. Recently, they announced that universities and colleges will stand to lose 60% of their funding if they fail to meet yet-to-be-determined performance targets. Previously, it was only 1.4%. They also made a series of announcements in January. Student assistance has been cut by $670 million. Grants for low-income students have been turned into loans, even on a retroactive basis. The government also canceled the 6-month interest-free period on student loans, all measures that are going to make it that much harder to access post-secondary education. While the Ford government did cut tuition fees by 10%, They fail to supplement that change with additional funding. So that means colleges and universities now have a budget shortfall of $440 million. And finally, as mentioned, they have defunded student unions, undermining their ability to represent their members and provide services such as running women's centers and pride centers and providing support for students in crisis. But Ford has no idea, quote unquote, what crazy Marxist activism that student movements have in store for him. The Ford government has cut $1 billion from social and community services over the next 3 years. And that's largely because of regressive social assistance reforms. They've essentially refashioned the system to limit access for folks with disabilities and force recipients into low-paying and exploitive jobs. These changes are in addition to the fact that the government cut in half a scheduled 3% increase to social assistance rates. And as an interesting tidbit, poverty was not mentioned once in Ford's budget. Alcohol, on the other hand, was mentioned over 35 times. So based on all of these examples, it's clear that the Ford government is trying to manufacture a crisis in just about every sector and community across Ontario. And Jason Kenney will likely do the same here in Alberta. That's what conservatives do, so that they can chronically underfund our public services, so that they can set the stage for privatization and greater contracting out, so that they can order more restructures and mergers within different public sectors and agencies, or eliminate them altogether, so that they can turn to individual funding models like charter schools, or what's happening now in Ontario, providing vouchers to access autism therapy for children, so that they can download greater responsibilities to municipalities without providing them with the needed funding, so that they can shift away from universality to means testing for access to program services, so that ultimately that they can dismantle our social safety net piece by piece. In 2017, hate crimes across Ontario surged to an all-time high, with attacks in Alberta increasing by almost 40%. Ontario, however, led that charge. In fact, hate crimes in Ontario against Muslim people rose by 207%, against Black people by 84%, and against Jewish people by 41%. And those are only the hate crimes that have been reported. We cannot let hate be normalized. Instead of recognizing this, Ford and Kenney have shown support for the Yellow Vest movement, further fueling racism, xenophobia, and fascism across the country. The Ford government has used extremely problematic language with the use of illegals, and they have created division with the sentiment that we should take care of our own first. The Ford government has disbanded expert committees to end violence against women, to combat Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Indigenous, and anti-Black racism. They have completely withdrawn cooperation to help fund the resettlement of asylum seekers. And most recently in the budget, they specifically targeted immigrants and refugees, stating that Legal Aid Ontario can no longer use provincial funds on these cases. That's 2/3 of their funding for refugee and immigration cases completely eliminated. They're also delaying justice in the courts, leaving unfilled adjudicator positions at the Human Rights Tribunal. This is causing widespread delays, undermining cases, and discouraging vulnerable people from seeking relief. In the eyes of Ford and Kenney, climate change is not real, and it's certainly not human-made. And they have no meaningful plan to address the fact that Alberta and Ontario produce the highest greenhouse gas emissions in the country. That's why Ford's very first move was to eliminate the cap-and-trade program and cancel 758 green energy contracts. The government then threatened to remove protections that prevented industries from polluting our drinking water. To provide a bit of context, these regulations were passed when contaminated drinking water killed 7 Ontarians and made thousands ill in 2000 with the Walkerton tragedy. They also threatened to allow developers to bypass regulations on land that is protected against urban development under the law. But when farmers and environmental groups formed a strong opposition to these 2 changes, they won. The government removed those provisions. The government did, however, manage to remove obligations for businesses to publicly report on their use of toxic substances, making it that much easier for them to produce and pollute these substances. And most recently, they cut flood protection funding in half. This is in the face of swamped neighborhoods and flooded homes in Ottawa. And of course, Ford and Kenney continue to rage against the federal carbon tax, despite not having a plan of their own to address climate change. And these are only just some of the regressive changes we've seen since Ford was elected 11 months ago. But the labor movement has also seen some wins. We maintained, for example, domestic and sexual violence leave and a $14 minimum wage. That's more than a 20% raise for Ontario's lowest paid workers. The next 4 years in Alberta will be difficult, but I know that this provincial labor movement will continue to respond powerfully. And the good news in all of this, and I have to admit it is hard to see that sometimes, is that the Conservative governments are giving life to a whole new generation of activists. Just last month, for example, more than 100,000 students from 700 elementary and secondary schools across Ontario walked out of their classroom in a student-led protest of the changes to public education. And on Friday, thousands of students across Alberta walked out of their classrooms in a student-led protest of the government's position on gay-straight alliances. All around us, we are seeing a steadily building explosion of new proposals, new experiments, new ideas, and new activism, and most importantly, a new basis for hope. We have the ability to fundamentally transform what is politically possible, to raise expectations for the working class. But waiting for the courts to defeat right-wing legislative agendas is not an option. Waiting 4 years for another election is not an option. Organized resistance remains our best chance at confronting state power and fighting for a progressive future. Especially if we want to build towards mass action and create serious political crises for the Ford and Kenney governments. At the Ontario Federation of Labour, we are working towards that goal through our Power of Many campaign. We are building a movement that will defeat Ford and his regressive agenda every step of the way in the lead up to the next general election and beyond. And we are building a movement that will demand a progressive future for every Ontarian based in decent work for all, public services for all, justice for all, and healthy and safe workplaces and communities for all. But that means creating a solid foundation rooted in deep organizing within our workplaces and our communities, engaging, educating, and agitating our members and our allies. By 2022, our next election, we will have reached over 1 million people and recruited over 10,000 new volunteers through our Power of Many campaign. But we cannot do that alone. So we are setting up the infrastructure to create rapid response networks and swing ridings across the province, bringing together grassroots activists, rank and file members, and folks that have never been politically engaged before, so that we can coordinate and lead escalating actions, both centrally and in communities across Ontario. Flyering, petitioning, canvassing, lunch hour and after-work meetings, small ZAP actions at MPP offices, strikes, shutting down intersections. These are all essential to building up a fierce opposition. We're creating various materials, issue-based flyers, regional fact sheets, a tracker of all government cuts, and traveling across the province to deliver presentations on what's at stake under a Ford government. Because we cannot allow conservative governments like the ones in Ontario and in Alberta to become legitimized. We cannot allow business as usual to proceed. They need to be challenged on the streets and in our workplaces. So now, more than ever, we have to demonstrate that a unified and strong labor movement, in partnership with our allies and the official opposition, can deliver the grounds for change that are deep and far-reaching. Thank you.